Good morning. My name is Bob McPherson. It's good to be with you. I appreciate Doug Major asking me to provide some contextual information for all the information you're getting about Bluff and the hole in the rock today. And in particular, we're going to focus on the Native American side of who was interacting with those pioneers down there in Bluff, what it was exactly their origin and language and so forth, where were they coming from, and what were some of the things that happened to them. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And our time frame is going to stretch all the way from 1880 to 1923. And we're going to look at the origin and language and lifestyle of three different cultures that we've got here in the Four Corners area. We'll start off with the Utes. If you take the Ute tribe, then they're predominantly in Colorado and, of course, northern Utah and southern Utah, as well as down into New Mexico and so forth. If you look at those, there are three large bands of Ute peoples. The ones we're most concerned about are called the Weemanooch, and they are the ones that are furthest to the west of the entire Ute domain. And they have a Plains Indian orientation, as you can see here. These folks, feathered war bonnets, teepees, Winchester rifles, horses. They were very much in keeping with the Plains Indian lifestyle, which would include groups like the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Arapaho, Comanche, and so forth. So there you can picture their lifestyle as what you see on TV a lot. Now, there's another group that is related to them. In fact, oftentimes people refer to them, and I don't think this is very necessarily correct, but they refer to the Paiutes as kind of the poor cousins of the Utes, because they're much more of a Great Basin group of people that lived in a very, very harsh environment and were spread out from the furthest eastern extension of their group goes into Monument Valley and Navajo Mountain, and then picture going all the way over to Cedar City, St. George area, into southern Nevada, down into northern Arizona, and then all the way up to northern Nevada. That's Paiute country. And they lived in a very stark environment, had a lot of challenges getting food and so forth. And so they weren't nearly as spectacular, I guess you'd say, as the Utes living in Colorado and in southeastern Utah. Both of these two groups speak the same language. It's a Numic speaking language. Their origins, everybody starts off, anthropologists and archaeologists start them off in Death Valley, and where they were before that, there's some discussion. People haven't totally agreed, but they definitely started out in the Death Valley area and came out and started to infiltrate and expand throughout the southern part of Utah and into the area of Colorado and so forth. So they're really quite an expansive group that were very much involved in hunting and gathering. This wiki up that you see here is kind of the home that the Paiute people would make as opposed to the teepee. Is kind of interesting. When Father Escalante came through here, when he got to southeastern Utah, his map maker, whose name was Miera, put both these wiki-ups and the teepees, because this really is the joining area for these two different groups when they came together and were living in this area and sharing resources. The next group, the Navajo, are very different from the Ute and the Paiute. They speak a language called the Athabascan language. The largest group of Athabascan speakers is found up in Canada, northern Canada, and over into Alaska. In the Southwest here, you've got the Apache and the Navajo. They speak the same language. A lot of times archaeologists and anthropologists like to talk about them coming down from the north and settling in this area. There are some people who would disagree with that, but the Navajo are a very, very different people than what you find with the Ute and the Paiute peoples. They would get much more involved with agriculture and livestock and would have a more settled life, although they would be involved with hunting and gathering, but not to the same extent of dependence as the Utes and the Paiutes. So those are the folks that we're going to be talking about, and talk a little bit about, you know, what did they do here when they got to this land? When we talk about the carrying capacity of the land, that just means how many people can you sustain on a particular piece of land, given how they make their living. So for instance, a hunter and gatherer, if you look at the Utes, take them as a great example, they might travel in a year's time through a large circuit of resources that would bring them to different places at different seasons because of the plants, the animals, the water resources, firewood that were available. And so they were very, very dependent upon what they could find as they traveled through different areas that they knew had those resources. The Paiute, living in the desert environment, had an even harder task than a lot of the Ute peoples, in that they were living in that desert environment where water and plants are the key. You do have some hunting and so forth, but there weren't as many animals. And so it was a very, very different lifestyle. And the Utes, where they were involved more with deer and elk and buffalo, those that extended out to the plains and so forth, had a different lifestyle than those living in the desert. And I'm sure you can understand that. Now, when you talk about the Navajo, because they depended more on agriculture and on livestock, especially in the later part of their history, in the more historical era, they were able to have more people in a smaller space, because they could grow their food, they could control it, they could store it and preserve it, and they would move between a winter camp and a summer camp, and each of those camps would have the qualities and characteristics that they needed. Along with that, and this is an important thing to understand, beyond the physical needs and interests of these people, the land was a living entity. All of these people, and I'm going to speak primarily of the Navajo because they had the most complex philosophical background. The land was a living entity and everything in it. A rock is a living thing. A tree is a living thing. Water is a living thing. An animal is a living thing. And at the creation of the earth, when animals and plants and everything were assigned by the holy people to do certain things and to have certain qualities and characteristics, they were given songs and prayers by which they would respond and help the people in that environment. You have lots and lots of places that are identified as being sacred or holy places for the Native Americans, and this is true of all of them, but the Navajo have perhaps the most elaborate example of that. And so when we look at the settlement of southeastern Utah, we talk about it in physical terms, and that's the Anglo orientation that people have. But for Native Americans, the most important thing, I mean, survival, of course, but the most important thing is that relationship that you establish between all of those things that inhabit that land, to include both the animate, which we understand well, and what we would classify as inanimate, or mountains and rivers and rocks and so forth, that also you can establish a relationship with. So we've got the difference here between hunting and gathering and livestock and agriculture. And this becomes really important because as settlement increases, not just of Native American groups, but also with the introduction of the Anglo people coming in, suddenly there's pressure being put on different groups. If you're involved in hunting and gathering, and all of a sudden those resources that you depend upon are being eaten up or destroyed by cows or sheep, you can see the problem that you're going to run into and why there'd be conflict. We'll talk about some of that conflict, but for right now, just realize that all three of these groups, and we're going to talk primarily about the Ute and the Navajo, are going to be interested in the same places, those places where there are resources, that you're going to have the settlers come in, the cowboys come in, and all these other Anglo economies that want to come in and take advantage of what the resources are in that area, which were often limited. Now, every group has to understand kind of what their area is or their boundaries and so forth. So for the Navajo and the Ute, and we're going to talk primarily about them again, but there are boundaries that were traditionally accepted and were often, when people crossed over those boundaries, they were in a different world. You enter into Ute land or you enter into Navajo land. From the Navajo perspective, their lands are bounded by the four sacred mountains, two of them in Colorado, one in Arizona, and one in New Mexico. You also have rivers that bound the Navajo territory. And for our purposes, the one we're most concerned with is the San Juan River. The San Juan River has traditionally been looked upon as the boundary between Navajo land and Ute land. And so as we talk about the trading posts and so forth that spring up later in their history, the San Juan boundary is an important thing to consider. It's interesting that I'm doing some work right now looking at Monument Valley Navajo history and culture. And it's interesting to me that some of the real old timers, who of course at this point are all gone, but when they were interviewed long ago, they would talk about Monument Valley as being kind of one of the places that belonged to the Utes and the Paiutes. And until you get down to the rock called El Capitan, everything north of that was Ute and Paiute. Today, Monument Valley is the iconic land of the Navajo, and you see it on pottery and pictures and in textbooks and everything as being definitely Navajo land. They were there, but there was also that area of conflict. And so one of the ways that these groups got together in a more friendly setting was through barter, through exchange. And the Navajo people would have certain things that they would exchange with the Utes, and the Utes would have things that they would exchange with the Navajo. And it was it was a time for peaceful relations as they were doing this exchanging. For our purposes, since we're focusing on the Bluff area, the area across the river is at a place called White Rocks, which is not too far away at all, was one of the trading places where Navajos and Utes would get together and they'd make their exchanges. But there was always this constant bickering. There was no unified government. There were family groups and clans and individuals that would, for one reason or another, raid the other group, the enemy group, and then come back across the river. And there's plenty of historic accounts explaining how that whole thing worked. And so since we're focusing on the San Juan River, although there were Navajos that lived north of the river, for the most part, that was the general boundary line that was recognized by both groups. Now, we mentioned other groups coming in to get involved and upset the whole scheme of, and I don't think we can call it balance, but the whole scheme of what had been going on before. And we're just going to touch on a couple of things just to get you kind of in the ballpark. This map that you've got here, you can see Santa Fe, and then you can see over there on the coast, Los Angeles, and you've got the Spanish Trail. The Spanish founded and were in New Mexico and founded Santa Fe around 1610. And they started to become a real presence there. From 1610 to 1821, the Spanish went through a whole series of agreements, treaties, sporadic warfare, slave trade, slave raiding. The Spanish Trail that you see there, that was a favorite thoroughfare for the slave trading and so forth, and horses as well. It was a very, very, we would consider today a very violent period. There was give and take on both sides. The Navajos raided the Spanish. The Spanish, raided the Navajos. The Utes often, not always, but often were friends of the Spanish. And so they would go ahead and raid the Navajos and bring the Navajos in to Taos and Abiquiu, and they'd have a slave exchange for products and things that they wanted. It was a very unsettled time. Mexican War, 1846 to 1848. And the Navajos are thinking, this is great. We've got a powerful group that is going to defeat the Mexicans. I ought to back up and just say, in 1821, the Spanish were surrendered their holdings in the New World here for the most part. And so all of a sudden Mexico became for the Mexicans. And so from 1821 to 1846, you've got the Mexicans in charge. And then from 1846 to 1848, you have the Mexican War, and the Americans take over a lot of that territory. In fact, we added about a third of the United States, continental United States at that time, giving us California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado, and New Mexico and Arizona as part of the United States. So the Navajos saw all this and they thought, oh, this is wonderful. We've got an ally. We've got a strong ally. The Americans won. They're going to help us to continue to raid the Mexicans and so forth. And it didn't work that way. The Mexicans, were vulnerable. The American army said, we'll take care of you. We'll protect you. You're now under our control, our citizens and so forth. So all of a sudden it turned, and the Navajos at first were surprised and then decided, okay, we're going to go ahead and we're going to raid the Mexicans. And if the Americans try to help them, fine, but we'll go ahead and fight them too. So from 1848 up until, and I'm going to use 1858, we'll just say a 10-year period, you have a lot of American agreements, treaties and so forth that were broken. And the Americans broke the treaties as much as the Navajos broke the treaties. It was a very, very fluid time. It was very, very difficult. And so by the time we get up to and you can go earlier than this, 1855, 1858, during that time period, in the late 1850s and the early 1860s, it became known to the Navajos as the fearing time. And this was the time when the Navajos were set upon by all different kinds of traditional enemies. So for instance, the Hopis fought the Navajos. And at times the Navajos still came in and traded with the Hopis, but generally speaking, the Hopis were against them. For our purposes up here, the Utes were extremely effective. And the United States military provided them with weapons. They provided them with the opportunity to go in and take whatever they wanted. And they could, even though the Civil War was going on at this time, 1861, 1865, during that time period, the Utes are raiding the Navajos and they're selling Navajo slaves down in Santa Fe and Taos and so forth. Americans tried to put an end to some of it, but it still continued. Eventually, the pressure got so great on the Navajos that they started to surrender in droves. And you hear a lot about the Long Walk, Navajo people. This is one of the two most traumatic periods in Navajo history, where Navajo peoples came in and collected at different spots, and there would actually be not one trail, but there were 4 trails that would take them from wherever they were living and surrendered to a place called Fort Sumner or Bosque Redondo. And for 4 years, the Navajos would live there, had a very, very difficult existence. There's just so many stories about it, but just realize it was very, very difficult. But at the same time, there were probably maybe as many as half of the Navajo Nation that never surrendered. And they stayed around in these outer areas where the Utes would not find them. And so Navajo Mountain, the Bears Ears that everybody talks about, the Kaibito Plateau, those were all areas in this region where Navajo people would go and hide out and form larger bands for protection and try to avoid any kind of confrontation, just stay off of the radar so that they wouldn't get policed up. This went on until 1868, when the United States military finally called off the Utes and other Indian groups. And there were also, I should mention, the Mexican volunteer armies that came out of Santa Fe. It was extremely effective. They were extremely effective in what they were doing. And so by the time we get to the point where the United States government in 1868 says, okay, Navajo people at Fort Sumner, you can now go back to your original places. Well, no, wait a minute, not really, because they were all over the place. So they said, we're going to give you a reservation, but it'll be in the heart of where you were before. So they drew a rectangular box that straddled, half it was on one side of the New Mexico, Arizona borderline, the other on the other half. And it was a rectangle. And said, okay, now you can go back there and you stay there and no more trouble. Well, the Navajos went back okay, and they rejoiced. They were so happy. But the other side of it was, there were 2 points to make there. Number one, they went back to where they were before the war ever took place. And so they're actually all over the place. And that's why the United States government over the next 20, 25 years would expand the Navajo reservation numerous times, because the Navajo people needed to have a place to live. And they just were already there. The other point to make on this is there was a lingering mistrust. All of the hatred and the fighting and the killing and the slave trade and everything that had been so predominant during that time ingrained in the Navajo people the fact that we are not friends with the Utes and we don't want to get near them because they cleaned house the last time we were in their vicinity. And so it was a slow advancement back to the northern part, into the northern part of the reservation. And Navajo accounts are very clear that until they knew that the Utes were going to leave them alone, they weren't going to go back into that area. Even then, the Utes still came down and raided into the Navajo area. So the Navajos had good reason not to get too too close and become too obvious or apparent or visible to the Utes, because there was that friction. And truthfully, today, there are not so much the younger generation, but those from the older generation still remember this. And there was not a lot of love in the past between the Navajo and Ute people. And so it, is well-founded issues. Okay, for our purposes, we're getting up here to Bluff now. Of course, Mormons come in 1880 into Bluff. And we're going to talk a little bit about the trading posts as a cultural scene, because it's very much a reason for the Navajo people to move closer to the San Juan River, because there's a difference between those posts that were on the reservation because they were government controlled, and then the posts that were off the reservation that were not under government control. And so in Bluff, there's been a lot of different trading posts that came about, and their main customer was the Navajo. And so we want to talk a little bit about this and just talk about, what was going on there. You have to realize that trading posts are a cultural entity. It brings white culture, Anglo culture to the Navajo. The Navajo bring their culture to the trading post. So it's a place of interaction. And I'm going to go over some books and so forth I've done on trading posts that will, if you're interested in pursuing this, but just realize that Navajo trading and Ute trading on the surface was similar, in that some of the cultural things that they would do when they entered the post and so forth was kind of a standard way. This is how you act when you go into the post. Very, very different than an Anglo person. You go in, the first thing you do when you go into the post is you sit down and you don't talk about money. You just talk about what's going on. And then eventually you might go up to the counter, buy something, one thing at a time, get it paid for through something that you're exchanging with them, like blankets or wool or whatever it is. Go sit down, come back later, buy another thing. This could be a whole day event. And so the cultural scene is very, very different. And that's what I want to get across for the Navajos and Utes. Okay, so I'm going to look at 3 advantages and disadvantages of posts that were here on the San Juan and were part of if you go from Aneth down to the San Juan Hill, that's the area that we're talking about. There's a lot of material here. I'm just going to skip over quickly. But Henry L. Mitchell, interesting person, Civil War veteran, came from Missouri. When the Mormon exploring party showed up, he told them, we're going to drive you out of there just like we drove you out of Missouri. Don't expect to have any friends here. And he was a grumpy old guy. And from, 1878, 79 to 1884, 85, he was in the Aneth area. I don't have a picture of his post. This is a picture of the Aneth trading post that is still there today. In fact, it's the oldest still operating existing business in San Juan County. It doesn't look like this now. It's been turned into a convenience store, which is the fate of most trading posts. Either that or they've just been let go and they deteriorated and been bulldozed over. But this is the Aneth trading post, probably in around 1895. This is where Henry L. Mitchell lived. And there's more stories about this guy and the things that he pulled. The bottom line is he did not get along with the Native Americans. He didn't like them, but he traded with them. But he always having the military come in that was called upon to protect him. And so he had a great business with the military. Every summer they'd come over and camp there because he's always crying wolf and so forth. There was reason for it. That butte down in Monument Valley, Mitchell Butte and Merritt Butte, Mitchell was the Herndon Mitchell was the person who was killed there, and that was Henry L. Mitchell's son. So there's connections here. Too much to talk about, but just realize that this was, Aneth has had trading posts from the very beginning. Prior to the Mormons ever coming in, there were trading posts there. Okay, another example of just the opposite of this Henry L. Mitchell was James L. Davis, who I think a lot of you are all studied up on the Hole in the Rock. You recognize that he was one of two families that in 1880 would come there in Montezuma Creek. William Hyde, you may be familiar with also. And these people were there 1880 to 1884. The big flood took them out, and so they moved on. But Hyde would stay in the area, but he had some, he would be the one who actually started the trading post, the Amasa Barton trading post down at the Rincon or San Juan Hill area. These people got along with the Navajo people and with the Ute people. Too many stories to tell, but just as an example, when the Utes were on the rampage against Mitchell and so forth, they would come and they would tell Davis, okay, stay close to your home. There are going to be some warriors coming through here. If they don't know you, you might get in trouble. So just be aware that, we're here. If we're here, we're going to protect you, but we just want you to know that this is going to happen. And Davis would do things like he'd bring them in and he'd feed them food. He'd fix their rifles for them. He was always fair in his dealings. He was really, really good. It was interesting that Amasa Barton had the exact opposite feeling towards the Indians. And he told Davis, he says, you treat these guys like these Indian people like pets. You feed them, you take care of them, all this kind of stuff. When I'm through trading with them, I want them out of here. I don't want them around, And so there's that different attitude. And we'll talk a little bit about Amasa in a few minutes. William Hyde was another person who started a trading post. In fact, he was sent down here by the LDS Church to establish the post and to establish trade. And he had a cable that stretched across the river, and they would attach a boat to it on a line, and they would ferry people back and forth across the river with their trade goods and so forth, exchanging at the post. Hyde was very well accepted and liked by the people he traded with. And so interesting character, exact opposite again of Mitchell. The San Juan Bluff Co-op, it's again, a huge story about it, but just realize that individual traders were kind of on their own. They had to keep things flowing, people coming in and out of the post, thinking that they're getting a good deal, and so forth. The Bluff Co-op was a different animal. This organization, of course, anybody in town in Bluff could go ahead and contribute to the store and become a shareholder in it. And that was the whole idea. And there were a lot of people that did that and were very, very successful. The nice thing about this is you've got more capital, and they expanded a lot of different things, not just the wool, which was a huge thing coming across the river with the Navajos, but trading for Ute deer hides was another thing that was very, very popular. But they would get into things like they experimented with actually having a wool processing factory with using native plants for the dyes and for the preparation of the wool. And they would bring in other entities. For instance, at one point, the San Juan Co-op had 32,000 head of sheep that they were keeping. And I may be wrong. That may have been cattle, but I mean, large amounts, large herds that were tied to both sheep and cattle that were tied to this business. And it was a going concern. Some years, believe it or not, they were able to pay 40% profits on the shares of these shareholders. Other years weren't as good, and a lot depended upon the economy beyond San Juan, obviously, because that's where you're going to be sending a lot of these things. But they had some advantages. And then the picture on the right here, you get a picture of Cumin Jones and his wife, Mary, who I think a lot of you will probably recognize. The other woman is, her name is Sorensen, and she was an advocate for helping Navajo people in their weaving and marketing their goods and so forth. But for the San Juan or Bluff Co-op, you had people like Cumin Jones, you had Christian Lingo Christensen, you had Thales Haskell, and there were other people who spoke Navajo, knew the language, and they had actually been called to work with Indian peoples. And so they were very, very accepted by the Native Americans. I've got some quotes here about what was going on in here, and I don't think I've got time. I'm afraid I'm running out of time, but it's a fascinating story, and the Bluff Co-op is very, very successful. Now, overarching all of this in the 1880s and 1890s, this whole land up here was called the Dark Corner, and it was a place where people would disappear if they got into trouble. This is Anglo people, as well as Navajo people, as well as Ute people. It doesn't matter. It was the Dark Corner. And because of the canyon systems and the trail systems and so forth, it was kind of a no man's land. And Albert R. Lyman talks a lot about that. The Galen Eastman, who was the Navajo agent in 1882, referred to this same area not as the Dark Corner, but as the land of death. And there's lots of examples of skirmishes that took place here, fights, people that were killed, and so forth. So the land had a definite reputation. As an example of the conflict, Amasa Barton, that you see on your left there, was in his trading post. He had breakfast that morning with some of the Indians, which is kind of contrary to what he said to Davis, but they went up to the trading post to trade, and he got into a squabble over some trade items and so forth, and he was killed. He was shot in the head. He lingered on for a week, but it didn't go well for him, and he eventually ended up dying. The man on the right, name is Bialili, and in 1907, after years of conflict against the agent at Shiprock, so forth, Bialili was his camp on the San Juan River that was fairly close to Aneth was raided. Supposed to have been the last cavalry charge against hostile, and I put that in quotation marks. Everybody was asleep when the camp was attacked. But the last cavalry charge in the United States against hostile Indians. I don't know if you can push it that far, but there certainly was a skirmish and people were killed, and the cavalry did come in and they actually did charge through that whole area. So interesting stories for San Juan. But the real conflict for the Utes especially were the Colorado cowboys. The Colorado cowboys, because of the large herds, I mean, we're talking about 50,000 cattle coming over from Colorado in the winter to go up through the canyons and graze on this winter range, where the canyons would protect the cattle from the elements more, and there was this pasturage. And then in the summers, where do they go? The cattle go up in the mountains, Blue Mountain. And then there are, the 32,000 cattle, whatever it is, with the Bluff Co-op people. And there are other cattle companies like the Carlisle Cattle Company out of Monticello area. They've got their cattle there too. So this is the reason that there's so much conflict. And the Colorado cowboys are, if you look at all the fights, and there were a lot of them, but if you look at all the fights that took place in San Juan, you'll see that most of those fights were against the cowboys from Colorado, as opposed to the Mormons, though the Mormons had their tussles also. But it was a very, very unsettled environment. And there was anybody that's done reading beyond, and read some of Albert R. Lyman's things and so forth, very, very much a time of conflict. For Bluff, and there were other things, but the 1915 fight with Senegat is probably the one that we could take just a few minutes to talk about. But Senegat, that good-looking guy, and he was good-looking. And when he went to trial in Denver, apparently there were a lot of Anglo women that were swooning over how good he was. But he got involved in killing a sheep herder. They had a card game, fight over the money, so forth. Sheep herder left. He'd ambush him, and people needed to bring him in. And again, this is a long story, but he had talked a lot of people out of arresting him. But in the he and his father, whose name was Polk, were camped right down where the Bluff rodeo grounds were located. That has now become a school, but that where the rodeo grounds were, they had a camp there. And not surprisingly, a group of Colorado cowboys showed up and were there to help the marshal to arrest Senegat. Well, it got started, and the Utes came out of their teepees, and they were teepees, came out of their teepees and saw this advancing ring of cowboys coming after him. There's no explanation what was going on, other than the obvious thing that the cowboys are coming after him. So they got their rifles and they started shooting. And this second picture on the right, you can see the man lying down. This is a reenactment taken by a man named Lorenzo Creel, who was in charge of this group of Indians. And he didn't write a lot, but he sure was a shutterbug. And this is a picture that he took a few days after this man, whose name is Joe Aiken, got killed. He stuck his head up too far and Polk shot him. And so, this is just a reenactment. But that place, I've walked to that place, and it's right on the corner. I don't remember the street, but you can identify the place exactly. It's right in the corner of where two streets intersect. So it's very much a part of still Bluff. You can still figure it out. Well, eventually, some of the Utes who were there living in town or were camped by the town and so forth, who never should have been killed, were killed, while the troublemakers, those that were not as friendly and were fighting, were up in the rocks above Bluff. And eyewitness accounts said they could have killed anybody they wanted to from the place that they were located. But eventually, these Utes would come in. They're all Utes except for the guy in the far left who's got that hat on. He was a Mexican, but they were all camped together and so forth. And so they were taken and they were put in the San Juan co-op store upstairs. And these were friendly Utes. These were not troublemakers. They willingly came in and surrendered. But as soon as they got in there, they were treated as prisoners of war. And they were put in a room, and they were tied up and so forth, taken out for questioning. And they were petrified. They were concerned. They were convinced that their captors, and mostly Colorado cowboys, but there were still Mormons involved in this. And they were sure that these Colorado cowboys were literally going to skin them alive, kill them, skin them alive, and then kill them. That was the kind of fear that they had. Well, okay. One of them, named Havain, tried to escape. And so when he got loosened up, he made it for the window. And that's a picture that Creel took at the time when Havain had tried to escape. The cowboy that was there shot him in the back, and it was what enough air movement and so forth that blew out all the lights upstairs in the co-op. But Havain suffered for 2 or 3 days and eventually passed. Eventually, Polk and Posey and Senegat and so forth would surrender at Mexican Hat, and they would come in, and Senegat would stand trial, but they eventually had to, the court found him not guilty. He came back, and he was still a troublemaker, but he died of tuberculosis fairly soon after that whole incident was brought to a close. The last thing, Posey, and everybody talks about Posey. Posey was involved in this. Posey was a Paiute as opposed to Polk and Senegat, who were Utes. The 1923 fight, Posey, called the last Indian War. I think it really more of a white man uprising. The Utes had no idea what was going to be going on, but they all got rounded up, put in the schoolhouse here in Blanding. There'd be a number of times where there'd be a shooting would take place. And of course, Posey would get wounded during one of those frays and would die a painful death. And eventually the stockade that was built in the middle of Blanding was opened up. The Utes were placed very intentionally, and they wanted to be there, down in Allen Canyon. And Allen Canyon became a reservation land where Easy Black was their agent for a while and helped them to get agriculture going and so forth. So that's why we went from 1880 to 1923. Lots of other things to talk about, and it's just too much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up here, take 5 minutes, and talk a little bit about San Juan historians. You cannot write San Juan history, especially in the earlier years, without being very, very grateful and living in the shadow of Albert R. Lyman. Albert R. Lyman was born in 1880. He died in 19, and I'm not sure, 75, 76, something like that. Kept a journal all his life from the age of 12 right until the day that he died. So I'm talking now to people who are interested in researching things. If you go to BYU, and there are other collections in other schools, not only here, but also some back east, but for our purposes, if you go to BYU, he's got something like 9.5 or 10 shelf feet of journals and diaries, his thoughts, writing, and so forth, that is a treasure trove if you can take the time to go through the day by day, what was going on in his life kind of material. He was a stalwart from a historian standpoint. I bless the day that Albert R. Lyman was born, because we had an historian right up until the time that he passed away. And so roughly 1880s when he was born, so 1892 or whatever. And he's recording this stuff, and he's accurate. Now, the history that he writes is from personal experience and from talking to people who were there and involved in whatever the incident was. And he anxiously went out and engaged those people to get their take on it. That's the kind of history he wrote, and we have to be so thankful for his doing that. Now, Doug, if you can turn this off and get me live on the camera, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history that I'm doing, okay, that I have done. And I do this not to sell books, but I get a lot of calls from people asking for help with different history questions. The year that Albert R. Lyman died is the year that I got here. And I wasn't an historian at the time. that would happen later. But I have continued to write history, but the history I write, I center more on Native Americans and so forth. So excuse my phone from ringing, but just a second here. Hey, Kaylin, I'm set. Okay, I'm all good. So I'll talk to you later. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. Bye. Okay. So I use a lot of documents and I use a lot of oral history from Native Americans. My area of specialty is more the Native American side than it is the Bluff Pioneer and San Juan history on the Anglo side. I do want to make you aware of some things that will help you if you're interested in pursuing some of the things I've talked about today. Again, my intent is not to sell books, but I will say this: if you want to see the things that I'm talking about, I'm going to have to go through them quickly because I'm running out of time. I've already run out of time. But just go to Amazon Books, type in Robert S. McPherson, McPherson, and it'll bring up all the books I'm going to show you. I apologize for going through these quickly. I'm just going to give you an idea. Jot the title down if there's something here that is of interest to you. But let me just go through this and again, this will be quick. Okay, so talked about fighting and warfare. There's a book here called Fighting in Canyon Country. And this book looks at warfare that goes all the way from the Anasazi through chapters on how Navajo and Ute generally waged warfare to specific incidents that took place here all the way up through the Posey War. Whole chapters just on Navajo conflict and Ute conflict. So that's a good overview if you're interested in the military here. A lot of you may not be aware that the cavalry at one point in the 1885, 1886 was going to build a cantonment area or fort-like area over in Monticello. And there's chapters on there, what they were about and what they were trying to accomplish. Okay, some general books. If you're interested in the Paul Harvey, the rest of the story as far as the Utes are concerned, I wrote a history of the White Mesa Ute community. It's called As If the Land Owned Us. And this book goes from the very beginning origins and so forth of the Utes all the way through the troubled eras of the 1900s and into today. Lots of things. It's not just warfare. There's lots of things. And to me, this book is important because the Utes, and I'm not in any way bad-mouthing Albert R. Lyman, but the Utes ended up getting characterized as totally the bad guy, if you will, in all of this. And they weren't, they weren't always the best. But this book takes things from their perspective and talks a lot about their culture, their environment, as well as their history. If you're interested in the Mormon experience from an environmental standpoint on the San Juan River, this one, river flowing from the sunrise, which by the way is a Ute term, how they call the San Juan River, gets into what was going on environmentally on the San Juan River. There are chapters in here that go through Native Americans and Spanish and so forth, but the focus of it is the lower San Juan, which is that part that runs through Utah. So this will give you some ideas from an environmental perspective of what was going on with the Mormons. Along with that, there's this book called Comb Ridge and Its People, A History of Iraq. And of course, Comb Ridge, you've got a lot of things going on there with the Mormons, but you also have lots of other events in history that centered around this very prominent rock formation just outside of Bluff. So it's a good overview, and it's got a lot about Navajo teachings. We talked about the sacred land. idea. There's a lot in there. There's a whole chapter on that. Now, if you're interested in pursuing trading posts, I've got 2 books. Actually, I got a third one, and I didn't bring it up. But there's one called Along Navajo Trails. That book deals with a Mormon trader living in Shiprock. His name is Will Evans, and there's a lot about the cultural scene. And it's a very interesting study of how a devout Mormon tries to fit Navajo beliefs into Mormon beliefs. And that's a whole nother topic. But he was very good at that. But he also gave a wonderful personal account of what trading posts were like and the day-to-day interaction. Now, if you're interested in the cultural scene of the trading post, this book, Both Sides of the Bullpen, is looks at trading from a cultural perspective. And there's information here. This is where you can find information about the Bluff Co-op, about Mitchell, about Davis and Hyde that we talked about, and lots of other things. But this is primarily looking at the trading post as a cultural scene. And it's really quite interesting. There's also posts up in McElmo, the posts in Aneth, the posts Hatch trading post, and so forth. So it really does a lot to talk about the cultural side of it, but there's also information from the historical side talking about that post. This I'm going to be really quick on: Traders, Agents, and Weavers. This is about the founding of the Shiprock Agency, which for some people might be interesting. It does not get up into southeastern Utah. Okay, it does not. But this is about the 2 Gray Hills trading posts and so forth. A lot of information that you never connected with the whole trading post scene that you find in here that you don't get so much in the cultural Both Sides of the Bullpen. I'm going to do 2 more books and then I'm going to call it quits. Okay, this book, Cowboy in Canyon Country. If you haven't seen it, it's a fun book. Finn Bayless passed away fairly recently. He wrote cowboy poetry. He came from a long line of families involved with the cattle industry. These are just kind of fun stories and lots of really fun cowboy poetry that he wrote. Gave me permission to do this based on interviews and so forth with him. It's just a fun book. But he goes back to the Hanson Bayless family and the Baylesses of the Bluff area. So if any of you that are connected to that family are interested, this one is available. And then finally, this is the rest of the story. I did San Juan County history, half of which is dealing with Native American history in San Juan, and half of which deals with the Anglo history in San Juan. It was published in 1995 as part of the state initiative to do county histories. It's a real good introduction to things, but as I did it, I realized that there's a lot of other information that just limited by space I could not put in. So this is the rest of the story for that. Okay, this book is called Life in a Corner, and it has a chapter, for instance, on the San Juan Gold Rush of 1892. It has a chapter on midwifery, and for those of you that are big on Jody Woods and so forth, there was a woman who came down from Salt Lake and for 6 weeks taught all the midwives, if I remember correctly, 1895, about the latest and greatest procedures for midwives. Interesting mix of culture and science. Nothing like you would expect today in some of the advice that was given, but it's very interesting. There are other chapters in here about homesteading out at Eastland, what it meant to be a cowboying in Canyon Country. Lots of different chapters, some of which deal with Bluff, some of which do not. But it kind of is the rest of the story if you're interested in San Juan history. I've gone over my time. I'm sure that Doug is ready to kill me, so I better say goodbye. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it gives you some ideas of things that you're interested in, things that you can pursue. And we'll just leave it at that. And good luck on your study of history.